Well, thanks again, Graham, for hopping on. This is the ninth edition of the Care Continuum podcast. Here we have Graham Skidmore of Harmony Health Institute. He's doing some really good work with them. He's doing some really good work in a few other areas as well. I don't think Graham has any shortage of things to do these days, so it's great to have him on. And I just wanted to start with your background, Graham. What led you to launch Harmony Health Institute?
Yeah, Josh, first, thanks for having me and willing to talk about this. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so obviously, like many people, it was my own journey, right? And so if you don't mind, I'll kind of give a little bit of my background, where the health system kind of worked for me, where it didn't work for me, which is then what led for me to kind of use those gaps, to develop my products and systems and things like that. So, the majority of my life, I understood myself through, one Western lens, traditional lens, one way of understanding the game of life, playing it, which is, essentially go get a job, make money, get a house, get a family, acquire stuff, do your part for the economy, and you're supposed to be happy and all is supposed to be good. Well, I did all those things. I checked all those boxes. Unfortunately, at the height of my success was also the height of my misery, the height of my burnout. And, I guess my height of my success, I was also, a member of a C-suite in a 20,000 person organization, right? So believe me, I checked the boxes, right? And so, but I was like, well, something's got to be missing here, because I did what I was supposed to do and I'm uber miserable. I don't even recognize who I see in the mirror anymore. So something's got to give, which then led me to leaving my corporate career of 21 years, which none of us expected me to do. And I said, all right, look, before I can go into my next chapter of life, I got to figure out how to get healthy and happy again, because, waking up every morning and going, why am I miserable? Why can't I get happy? Why does my body feel like it hates me? Is no bueno for me. So that led me down, the path of understanding myself again through the traditional Western lens. And so along that journey, I was diagnosed with autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, dyscalculia, alexithymia, and then Irlen syndrome, which is what these glasses are. It's definitely, they're not a fashion statement. And I think there might have been one other thing, but I was like, all right, that's cool. I got enough to work with here based on those diagnoses. And look, and at that time, just a second, it looks like my speaker changed. Oh, there we go. Okay. Anyway, and so, and so, at the time, it was very helpful for me, because what it allowed me to do was it gave me a vernacular to speak from. It allowed me to put emotions and words to things that I could feel, but not necessarily articulate. Right. And so it was good and helpful. But then what also happened is the same way that words can lift us up, words can bring us down. And so what I found was the more that I leaned into those labels or identities, the symptoms also, became a big part of me. And so all of a sudden I found myself struggling in areas I didn't struggle with. I found myself, experiencing a world from a place of fear that I'd never been before, anxiety higher than ever. And so I started, well, this is crazy. Something else has got to give here, right? And so I had a little breakdown moment in my living room. Also had a conversation with a friend who was like, hey, you're actually like, her terms were, like a medium psychic, et cetera. I'm like, what are you talking about? You're crazy. That stuff isn't, is a bunch of hoo-hoo, wow, like, get away from me with all that stuff, right? But then I started to, but then again, once you're miserable, right, you're willing to open your mind to a lot of different things. And so I said, all right. So then I spent the last 8 years understanding myself through the Western lens, the Eastern lens, indigenous, spiritual, neurotypical masking, neurodivergent, spiritually gifted, and a being of consciousness. And what that allowed me to do in hindsight was recognize, okay, I recognized when I was a part of the system and it worked for me, right? When I identified as a corporate, straight, white male supporting the status quo, I operated from a place of privilege. I understand what I got. I understand how I was supported and things like that. Then once I decided to not see myself through that lens anymore and operate that way, I was no longer supported. And all of a sudden the world was very different. I'm like, whoa, this was pretty crazy. And so, recognizing those gaps along my own personal health journey of seeing what did I need at what time, at what sequence, to help me to really become comfortable in my own skin. Because what I didn't lack access to healthcare. I didn't lack access to resources, right? I had concierge medicine, right? I had very helpful doctors. I had plenty of people that were willing to work with me, but they all wanted to work with me to put me into their modality, right? But what I needed first and foremost was to get comfortable in my own skin and to understand myself before I could understand myself through some other lenses, right? And so that's really what I spent the last 8 years of my health journey, where my whole job, right? I didn't really work. My job was understanding myself through these different lenses. And then in hindsight, I said, all right, let me figure out, what a framework is that could have walked me through this. And then let me talk to some other people and see, based on their journeys, does this framework apply to them? Right. And so that's kind of how that was kind of then what got me to this spot and getting started in the health and wellness space.
That is fascinating, Graham. I mean, that's a great story about sometimes how professional satisfaction, financial freedom, all these things are boxes that are checked that you have all of them checked, and still you don't feel good about it. So it's that just goes to show you that it's not, inner happiness and inner peace is there's a lot of different layers to it, and I think that uncovering those is obviously extremely important, and that's part of what your vision is. And so that's what I kind of wanted to touch on. I mean, it seems like there was a moment where you felt that the traditional healthcare model wasn't addressing what patients actually needed, and that's probably was your own experience. That night in the living room, and then you go to a doctor and he tells you got 8 things wrong with you, and you're like, well, that doesn't. Okay, well, I mean, I don't feel like I do, but okay, whatever you say, and then kind of like expanding on that and learning more, and so I guess that leads to what was the initial vision for Harmony Health, and how has that evolved since you started it?
Yeah, it definitely has evolved quite a bit. We started it
Hmm.
out as a bit more because I have a partner in this,
Hmm.
Jamie, and she
Okay.
comes from a bit more of a traditional background, right? She's a doctorate in physical therapy, almost sort of completed her doctorate in chiropractic and counseling, right? And then she's also had her own spiritual journey and it's kind of incorporated that, but it started as more of a concierge medicine along those lines. And as we were trying to figure out, working with investors, trying to pitch the vision, it was a struggle finding stuff to land. And finally, when somebody said to me, hey man, this would really be better served as a nonprofit. And so once we were able to focus on the purpose versus the profit aspect, that's really when things then took off. And so we just in the last couple of months switched from a for-profit to a nonprofit model. um and it's then started to retool the purpose and speaking from from the place of purpose. And so we went from, and I guess the biggest part of that is our overall vision that guides everything that we do is that, based on our own experiences and recognizing you know the life that we lived, the quality of life that we thought was possible, and the limitations that were associated with that compared to where we've been able to get to, the quality of life that we have now, and saying, hey, we never would have thought that what we're experiencing now is even available, right? So we said, all right, there's a lot more to this world that, and so how can it really be aspirational but not so aspirational that people go, okay, it's too pie in the sky? And so that came up with our vision of, but we firmly believe that we can see a world of happy, healthy, and empowered people, right? And so our focus on bringing that is through education, tools, and systems, right? And it's
What? Who?
obviously, yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
please.
Oh no, I was just going to ask, kind of expanding on that. Who's the ideal patient, that you're working with today?
Yeah, I think the ideal patient or member, just got to try to
Member.
stay away from the
Hmm.
patient just because
Yep.
of legal stuff, and I don't want any.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. We'll go with
Yeah,
member for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
and it's kind of a and so yeah, I think our ideal member is somebody who's not achieving their quality of life through the Western and traditional approaches alone, and is also open to non-traditional and or alternative approaches as a complement. Because it's not about and this is where I think a lot of the integrative or I'll even call it semi-integrative and or other non-traditional healing modalities come into have a challenge, is that they go in conflict with each other, right? Traditional medicine says, you know, traditional Chinese medicine is hooey. What are these meridians and stuff like that? If you can't show it to me on a map physically, then it's bullshit, right? And then you've got spiritual stuff that says, traditional medicine doesn't understand. It only treats symptoms. It doesn't understand the energy, and even the Eastern teaching as well. It doesn't understand the energy body and doesn't treat it, things like that, right? And so they talk about who's better, when instead what we really need to be focusing on is when do we use which one, and how do we figure that out for ourselves, right? And so that's really where our main focus is helping people to recognize when to do that. And so obviously, so finding somebody who's at that spot where they're like, hey, I'm looking to explore the different things because I know that there's more to this game of life, there's more to this health and healing journey than what I've experienced, because what I'm experiencing isn't getting me where I want to go.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think that's a good way to put it. As far as industry trends, you're in a really interesting space, especially right now with the functional integrated medicine seeming to be gaining a lot of traction, especially over the last couple of years for a variety of different reasons. Whether it's societal, and whether it's just more information that's out there um, about how, sometimes Western medicine can be a one size fits all solution that doesn't work with all the different so many different people needs so many different things. It's not a one size. It's never a one size fits all. That's why it's called a practice because these doctors, these providers, and professionals are always practicing, right? So, I guess what shifts are you seeing in patient behavior? Are you seeing people becoming more proactive versus reactive?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's definitely a massive shift that's happening very quickly, in society with being open to alternative approaches, and even in the healthcare industry. Right? We're both here in Chicago, and so Northwestern, hospital. I think everybody would agree that they're prestigious, they're accomplished, they've got plenty of credibility, right? And even they have a division focused on offering traditional Chinese medicine, which I thought was really cool and really telling. And so I think that, I think that there's a lot of both practitioners, institutions, and then patients that are open to it and recognize that Western medicine doesn't have a monopoly on all of the answers and doesn't have everything figured out. However, one of the challenges that exists is the insurance factor, right? Either a lot of people rely on insurance to be able to afford any type of healthcare, which is then limiting because insurance doesn't cover a lot of these things. And so the more that some of these traditional places offer some non-traditional and are then able to kind of play underneath that insurance umbrella is really important, right? And so I feel like there's kind of two approaches that are going on right now. One approach is which is look, everybody knows that we're within a broken system, but we can still optimize within a broken system. And that's where I feel like there's a lot of the current focus is how do we do better, with the broken system, and how do we help more people? And then there's the other approach, which is in order to create something new and allow the place to emerge, I just got to take a first principles approach and build a new approach from scratch. And both are needed, right? Because you can't just, pretend like, hey, we're just going to walk away from the existing system. That's not a real viable solution, right? So you need both. So there's plenty of people that are focused on the optimization aspect of the existing system. I'm more focused on the first principled approach of just, hey, that just isn't working. So what does it look like if we were to start from scratch and building a new healthcare model today? And that's where I'm focused. And then the other part that's like you talked about individuals. Look, and the other part of my I don't know if thesis is the right word, but the point that I'm trying to prove is that we also all have individualized physiologies. And so this one size fits all approach to physiology that we're all just simple biomarkers, right? The only, the only way that I'm going to demonstrate that is to demonstrate that, right? So I don't really talk about it so much, but with treating people and then being able to use our data and use cases will then help to open up, that next door. And then also one of the products we'll be offering down the road then once we've got enough data and use cases behind everything is being able to offer the individualized plans of care that treat individualized physiologies at scale, because that's part of the because that's the pushback in the current healthcare system is, well, if everybody's a snowflake, how can you really create systems in a scalable model, right? Well, let me show you.
Right, right. No, that's a good point. And as far as where do you think, where do you think traditional healthcare is still falling short? On top of the insurance piece, do you think it's that one size fits all mentality? Because I think that uh, it's it's starting to, you've seen that shift between Western and Eastern or holistic. And I think that sometimes, as far as health goes, the things that we eat in this country, I think is a big factor in some of the health issues and some of the maybe mood. disorders or whatever, what have you. But I think that that is a big deal of what we eat, what we consume, and some of the culture of our country. Not that it's a bad thing. I mean, I love it just as much as the next guy. But I also understand that where it comes short. Is that some of the things that you're seeing as far as traditional healthcare, still falling short?
Yeah, so I think that there's some practical and there's some philosophical aspects. And you're absolutely
Mhm.
right. I mean, seed oils are horrible, but try to find a product without seed oils in it, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And then the other challenge is even if plenty of people say seed oils are bad, but then you have the quote unquote science that says no, seed oils are good. When as long as then you have saying one group saying seed oils are good, and you have the money behind that supporting it, well then you have traditional healthcare saying, well, no, we're saying seed oils are good. So if seed oils don't work for you, then you're the problem, not the product, right? And that's one of the
Mhm.
biggest like philosophical things when a person has a problem with something, we label them as the problem and call them too sensitive, or they have too sensitive a system, instead of saying, no, we're just putting crappy products on the market for people, right? And then look, and I think there's also an aspect of easy inconvenience, right? It's kind of like, hey, why do I want to go through and do the hard work? Why do I want to affect my diet? Why do I want to run up my budget when I can just go try to find pills to take to offset the symptoms that I have? And in some cases, right, there's economic and practical reasons that cause people to go down their paths. Believe me, I'm not judging by any means. We all got our own
Mhm.
journeys, and we all got our stuff to figure out, and things are and the struggles are real. Um, and then you've also got the approach, and people are just taught that we're not really taught, at least I was, and in my exposure has been, we're not really focused here in the Western culture on preventative medicine and preventative health. It's more of you only go to the doctor when something's wrong. You don't go to the doctor to make sure that you're right. Right. For example, one of the biggest things that's focused on in Eastern but not Western is breath work, learning how to breathe properly. Right. Instead, when we say, hey, I'm not breathing right. Okay, well, here's an inhaler. You must have asthma. Okay. Oh, you're struggling at nighttime. Here's a CPAP machine, right? Where, again, once I learned how to breathe properly and I recognized, you know, how my body, my nervous system, anxiety, everything was affected by that. My, asthma, other respiratory challenges, I couldn't believe it. I'm like, how the heck did I go my, 40 some odd years of my life not knowing how to breathe properly, right? Like I would
Mhm.
have never thought that that was the
Mhm.
case, right? And so, but there's also then a lack of motivation. This is one of the challenges within the capitalist society. There's plenty of great things about capitalism, but one of the challenges is if there's not money involved and not a monetary upside, there's a lack of motivation to make it part of the systems, and so that's where by being a nonprofit we can focus on just doing what's right by the patient, not necessarily having to worry about strictly
The
what's the money
monetary
that's driving
value.
by, yeah, the monetary value. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's just unfortunately, it's just a fact of life. And I completely agree with you because if everything were about making sure every company and every organization were if the goal their true goal was to have their population as healthy as possible, let's be honest, a lot of things would change. And so obviously operating within that within that construct, it can be tough. And, so that just kind of brings me to, on the flip side, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that you face in scaling a clinic like yours?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges that I face is because things that I teach is that we're, all of our own individualized physiologies. We're not all meant to be on the same journey. And we all don't learn the same way, right? And so how do I create the education and the systems and tools that allow somebody to kind of create their own self-guided health journey, but not have it be I need it to be broad enough that it resonates with everybody and is inclusive to everybody, but not so broad that people don't know where to start and don't know where to go next. Right. And so
Mhm.
that's where I just, so I know what's worked, the kind of the flow that I've experienced, or and some others, but look, that's, this is a handful of people. I need more data to recognize, okay, how do I create that construct and that framework then to provide that, right, to people. And so I think that, it boils down to segmentation and the ability to kind of segment, whether it be segment the user experience, um, you know, based on each person's individualized goals. Because even while there's individualized goals, there's also just so many goals. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
There's
Yeah.
only just so many ways to measure, health and success. And so
Yes.
yeah, so instead of us anchoring into tests, blood work and things like that, which are important, right? Instead, what we're focusing on is because that stuff already exists, right? I don't need to recreate the wheel there.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
And so what we're saying is the way that we're going to define success is what is it that you want to be able to do in life that you can't today?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
not then let's
Okay,
build
love
that
that.
system around you to support you to get there. Because going back to the biomarkers and everything else, yes, of course, things like blood work and blood pressure and all that stuff is important. But let's also be honest and acknowledge the reality that Western medicine doesn't give you any guarantees that say if your chart works this way, you will never be ill, you will live to be this long, and you will have this quality of life, and you will be able to
Hmm.
have this type of mobility, et cetera, right? Like that doesn't exist. There aren't those guarantees that we see. In fact, we see, too many times we see people that fit the chart and then die early, fit the chart and don't look at it. I remember when I was sitting down with my doctor after physical and he goes, you shouldn't look like you do on the outside with these test results.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, that's a good example. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm
Yeah.
like, Doc, yeah, I know. Tell me
Hmm.
about it. Right.
Yeah. And I also think, just to your point, there's a lot of invisible barriers that people have with where they are, as far as where they are, and the gap between where they are, what they want to accomplish. Oh, I don't have time, or oh, I can't do this, and then like that mentality starts to kind of fester into other areas, and I've seen it. I mean, you know, you can make an excuse for anything, but like, what is it that you truly want? And it could be simple. I just want to be healthy. I want a healthy family, and I want to be financially stable, whatever it is. But I think having goals and being able to reach them and not and eliminating fear sometimes and doubt are strong, right? Fear and doubt are two very strong things that hold a lot of people back from doing what they want to do. And I think that's important. And I'm sure that's part of your, maybe if it's not direct, indirect, part of the a treatment program is just helping people understand their true capabilities and being able to use them, and I think that's really important and powerful too.
I mean, you just hit on a couple of really key important things right there. And one of the things
Hmm.
that Western medicine acknowledges but doesn't understand well enough is how guilt, shame, fear, and trauma manifest physically in terms of ailments and illnesses and ailments and things of that nature, right? And how that fear-based approach is so inhibiting and prevents us from achieving our potential. And so unwinding that and helping people to become comfortable and confident in their skin and reframe that fear and guilt and shame into learning and understanding and gratitude, right, is huge. And so one of the roles that we have that we're in, and introducing into our healthcare model is the role of a facilitator. And the role of that facilitator is essentially somebody that you can relate to, because the person will the member will choose which facilitator they want. We have a handful of them just starting out here, and it's really important that that facilitator that the member chooses is somebody that they can relate to, right? Because then now you've got somebody who's walked in your shoes that you can
Hmm.
ask guidance to. And so instead of saying, well, here's what I would do when I was in your situation,
Hmm.
well, we all, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. What we really want is, to talk to that person who's like, hey, here's what I did when I was in
Hmm.
your shoes, and here's how you can figure it out for yourself. Right. And I feel like, and that's a really powerful ally to have,
Hmm.
because not only does that person help you with, the tactics and the strategy, but they help you with the grace that's needed along that journey to cut yourself slack, to not beat yourself up, let's say
Hmm.
with motivation and other
Hmm.
things. Right. Because, look, that's part of the journey.
Hmm.
Is that not everything is just a straight shot up. And so, learning how to love
Absolutely.
ourselves I mean, I can't even explain to you just, or I wish I could express how much it changes when we learn how to give ourselves love, acceptance, and appreciation, as
Hmm.
opposed to, you know, fear and anxiety and beating ourselves up, thinking that we made all these mistakes, that we should have figured stuff out, we should have
Hmm.
avoided
Hmm.
that, right? Well,
Hmm.
we're not meant to have had it all figured out. We're meant to live and learn.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can look at any of the, CEOs of the Forbes list or whatever you want to do. Everyone in their life has, at one point or another, faced adversity. And it's not about facing adversity. Everyone does. Everyone makes mistakes. We're all human. But how do you respond to it? And how do you work through it mentally? By yourself or with help, because people need help, whether it's just talking to your spouse or a family member or a friend. Sometimes that's helpful. But I think a lot of people, some people deal with adversity in a different way. When you shell up though, when you kind of go into a shell and internalize things, and I've been there before where I've had problems, and everyone has their problems, but when you internalize it and try to kind of my problem was, I was trying to be too strong. And, to me, strong meant like, that I wasn't trying to make anyone else like I didn't want to put my problems on anyone else. It was just like me internalizing, like, oh, I can deal with it. I'll be fine. And like sometimes, you need to kind of let it out a little bit, just to, and people want to hear the people in your life who care about you. They want to hear. They don't want you to internalize that stuff. And I think that I've seen that before the other way, where someone's come to me and I've told them that. And I think that sometimes it's easier for you to like say, oh, like, you need to do this. But like when it comes to yourself, then you're like, oh, well, that doesn't apply to me because like I don't deserve that, or I don't, that's not what whatever. So I think that that's like a lot of psychology is really powerful. The human mind can work in so many different ways. And I think that you obviously seen that for yourself. You've seen that for, your members as well. And I think that that's one of the really important things about, functional medicine, and about, clarity and confidence in your life's purpose. So that's a really, important thing as well. And so, yeah, but as far as, so, as far as the clinics, I've talked to a few clinics who are incredible, clinically, and I think we kind of mentioned this, but struggle with consistently attracting, the right kind of patients. Have you seen this as well? People who actually understand and commit to this type of care.
Yeah, before do you mind if I comment on some of the
Yeah, yeah,
comments you just made?
absolutely. Please do, please
Cool.
do. Yeah.
Because again, you're touching on so many important things, and this
Hmm.
is another example of where what you talked about is one of these things that's like taught, but somehow it hasn't trickled down to it being standardized, which is
Yep.
and what I'm going to refer to is the you know even Western medicine and men, everybody understands that men have estrogen and testosterone, right? Like, and they recognize that they need both. It can't just be all testosterone, and it can't be all estrogen, whatever, right? And so energetically, we also have, masculine energy and feminine energy, which is different than being masculine or being feminine, right? The same way that, the hormones produce results, so do they. And so, and one of the things that I find that's very interesting, and I get it, I mean, I chuckle about it because I go, oh, if we could just get out of our own way, is the way that men are taught, and it's been standardized to um, ignore or not lean into their feminine energy. And when I let me first, I guess I should probably provide my definitions. Again, I'm oversimplifying this, but for masculine energy is strictly focusing on the result, where the feminine energy is focusing on the journey, right? And I think that that's one of the things in today's culture. We look at it, we're so focused on result, get there now, right? But then when you go and you talk to executive coaches, when you talk to and you listen to athletes, they talk about trust the process, do the reps, the learning is in the journey, right? And which is all in other ways of saying lean into your feminine energy, because you need to appreciate and learn from the journey just as much as you need the destination, right? And so I think that that's another big thing that helping men to understand how to lean into both, right? Because if you just lean into your feminine energy, we're always worried about the journey, where you're focused on the journey and never worried about the destination. Well, then you're like a kite in the wind, right? And so that's got a set of challenges. And likewise, if you're so focused on just getting to the destination, you're missing out on that entire learning opportunity and growth opportunity that comes from the journey itself, right? So we need to be, and so it's one of those things I get a kick out of it, right? Because again, it's taught at the highest levels. It's reframed because you're not going to, you don't want to tell athletes to lean into their feminine energy. That's going to be a little, probably, woo woo or taboo or something like that, right? So it just gets repackaged anyhow. So I just think that that's one of those, another example of I'm gonna call it repackaged spiritual principles, but because there's baggage around things, right? It's had to be renamed. So, but getting back to then to your question about, you know, where do I, do we see different clinics and seeing that stuff? You know, I don't, this is where, again, this is, I'm sure that, look, I'm not going to claim to have seen every single practice, know every single thing that exists in the world. All right. So before, but from what I've been exposed to, what I still see are places that are either focused on their modality only. And, they may not claim that their modality is all encompassing. Some do, which again is certainly a challenge. But it's also still focused on accepting the limitations of the existing system and trying to make the best in a broken world, as opposed to just saying, what do we need to do to make it better, right? And there's not enough people that are stepping back and want to and say, wait a second, let's just play this game, let's just play this out, and let's just say that Western medicine does have the answer. Let's just say that Western medicine has the monopoly on having all the answers and figuring it out. Let's say that that's true. Do we really want to look around and say, okay, we figured it all out, this is the best we could do? That's what scares the crap out of me, right? Is when we get to the spot where we are just so accepting of it, right? And so that the statements of, well, there's something wrong with everybody. The way that we normalize being ill, the way that we normalize feeling crappy, the way that we normalize requiring medications, look, is a problematic symptom in the system, because as long as that's normalized, we're never going to, that holds us back from believing and seeing how much better things can be. Ooh, I think you're on mute.
Not sure how that happened.
There you go.
But what I was trying to say is that that was a great way of putting it. I think the one thing that stood out to me in what you just said though is, yeah, I mean, I played sports growing up. I played football, basketball in high school. Would have probably played in college if I didn't tear my ACL. Maybe that was a blessing in disguise, but well, tearing ligaments never. But anyways, the point is that I could see how, especially when I was playing, like you don't want anything to do with feminine energy, quote unquote. It's like a stigma. It's like, no, 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 no. Feminine? Like, that's like, but now, 20 years later, you kind of look at that and it's like, it's not like exactly what it means, but it's like, your tapping into your emotions is important, especially when you have when you need to compartmentalize everything in your life, right? Like, having multiple jobs or having one job and having a family. How do you deal with your friends? How do you deal with this and that? There's just so many things that go into being a high functioning adult, as you know, that it's just hard to, you have to be able to control and compartmentalize in life. And I think that that's part of tapping into your emotions and part of, what you were talking about as well. Because if you have all that stuff under control and you have a good functioning family life, and you have a good social life, you're professionally you're doing well. I think those are the three main boxes that people look at, but there's a lot more in between. Your health, um, your physical health, your mental health. There's just so much going on in life as it is. Then you just have to be able to. I think being able to have that tap into that feminine side is what you're saying, is that to me helps with compartmentalizing, and it helps with being able to handle all of it as best you can, because there's no manual on how to handle this stuff. And everyone, what you learn growing up, and I think what you learn in college years, et cetera, early 20s, is how to take care of yourself and how to, from the beginning and the basis of it. And then it just gets harder as you get older. So it never gets easier. And I think that finding ways to cope and even learning to breathe correctly, things that you would never think are important or think were even, for lack of a better term, stupid when you're growing up, uh, you just realize that actually this stuff is important. And I know that one day I'll tell my son, he's 17 months right now, so I have no idea what I'm talking about. But in 10 years, if I try to tell him some of this stuff, he'll be like, Dad, what are you talking about? Like,
Yeah.
but then eventually one day, the cycle of life, he'll understand too, So like, just like my parents, told me growing up that like, some of this stuff, and I just, probably shun them or shut them out or whatever, just like, a 12-year-old kid boy does. But yeah, no, I think that that's some really important concepts, Graham. That really, really fascinating work what you're doing with Harmony Health. And I guess my next question is, looking ahead, what are you most focused on over the next 6 to 12 months at Harmony Health?
Yeah, again, I'll make one comment if I can on the thing. So I
Yep.
think if you think about it, right, when is it ever worked out for us when we've suppressed our natural state, when we've suppressed our emotions, when we've suppressed our thoughts? They always come back out somehow, some way, and
Yep.
usually after they've been suppressed and they come out, it doesn't work out for our benefit, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's
Exactly.
right. So learning how to, and again, that's the stuff when we suppress that stuff, that's going to manifest in us some way. That's going to give us some sort of illness. That's going to give us those ulcers. That's going to give us those stomach and GI issues, right? I mean, that's, so, we don't have, a lot of our quote unquote health crisis or mental health crisis is, is self-induced because we forgot really what it means to be a human, and we forgot about that individuality and the comfort to be ourselves. And instead trying to, to focus on, conforming to something that may or may not be our natural state. But anyway, over the next, 6 to 12 months, you know, the I'm what I mean the couple most important things for us right now is we're in the pilot phase of with a small group of people working out the bugs with the workflows, and then also, like I said, I needed to uh, enrich the user experience with some of the tools and products, so that they're not too broad, but can guide everybody through. Being a nonprofit, right? Fundraising is obviously an important thing that I'm learning all about that new journey. And let me tell you, whatever pride I had left after this journey is certainly gone. Now that I've started asking people for money to
Yeah.
support
Yeah.
and things, and then from there, and then the third part from that is once we've got the pilot and we've worked out the bugs, once we've and then and I've got more of the fun, then it's starting to share the use cases to challenge existing paradigms, through evidence-based examples.
Okay. Very great. I guess that leads to my next question is, what does winning look like for Harmony Health a year from now?
Yeah, I think to us, winning means, to us, to me, winning means being able to help people that think that they have something wrong with them or are broken, um, to heal and to recognize that um, everything, generally speaking, things happen as they either were supposed to and or needed to for them to have the life that they wanted, and to become comfortable in their own skin and love who they see in the mirror. I mean, essentially, accepting, loving, and appreciating who you see in the mirror is my ultimate measurement of success for everybody. Whether you believe in what Harmony Health represents or you're in the traditional medicine,